To say that there have been a lot of Stephen King adaptations throughout the years would be a massive understatement. To date, King has had over 65 of his novels published, and over 75 of his stories have been faithfully, some not so faithfully, adapted for TV and the big screen. However, I'd like to focus on a particular movie from Stephen King that was not an adaptation from any of his previous work or existing material. And that movie is Sleepwalkers, from 1992, directed by Mick Garris, who not only has arguably the best hair in the horror industry, next to Jamie Lee Curtis and Tom McLaughlin, of course, but is one of the most prominent voices in the realm of horror fandom and appreciation. First off, I have to admit I was never a huge fan of Mick Garris' work as a director, but in recent years I find a certain level of charm and appeal in most of his films, most notably the slept-on sequel, Psycho 4: The Beginning, and of course the balls-out, badass Critters 2: The Main Course. When it comes to Stephen King adaptations, however, Mick Garris' efforts seem to be hit or miss for the most part. With the exception of The Stand, I'd have to say the majority of these directorial outings from Garris have been pretty bland and underwhelming for my personal taste. That's not to say I don't enjoy them all to some degree, but I find that most of these adaptations like The Shining, Desperation, and Bag of Bones just don't speak to me personally or possess a rewatchable quality. But the one film from Mick Garris that is endlessly rewatchable and which does speak to me like a warm, cuddly little kitten mewing for milk is motherfucking Sleepwalkers.
Clovis.
This movie is rock and roll. It's cocaine. It's the cinematic equivalent of carby comfort food. In recent years, I've noticed that a great deal of mainstream horror films tend to take themselves a little too seriously at times, dealing with a great deal of heavy-handed themes, mostly regarding grief, trauma, power dynamics, or personal politics. Quote-unquote trauma porn seems to be all the rage nowadays. And that's not to say I don't appreciate rich subtext that emphasizes the importance of conveying said themes through a horror outlet. But I can't help but notice a dearth of campiness and fun that used to exist in horror storytelling. Even George Romero's masterpiece Dawn of the Dead, as prescient and socially relevant as the allegory is, was still able to entertain audiences and revel in a lot of the fun and comical aspects of horror. Now, am I saying that horror should always be funny and cater to meatheads looking for cheap thrills and gory gimmicks? Absolutely not. Many enduring horror classics, such as Don't Look Now, The Brood, Possession, and Rosemary's Baby, don't rely on such tricks and tropes to deliver the goods, nor do they wink or nod at horror fans or reach any absurd level of levity to let the audience off the hook. These horror films have their place, and I do personally prefer the bleak tone and style of the aforementioned classics over all the schlocky shit I was inundated with throughout the 80s and 90s. Having said that, I believe it comes down to mood more than personal preference. As fans and audience members, we sometimes seek out horror films that reflect the harsh realities of society and explore the dark side of human nature, and other times we seek out horror films simply as a form of escapism, to provide us with a little comic relief and give us a break from the barrage of bad news and divisive media that plagues every angle of online information and discourse. The older I get, the more I think of horror as a broad landscape as opposed to a restrictive genre. This brings me back to the movie Sleepwalkers. Stephen King wrote this wild, wacky story with the sole intent of developing the project for the big screen. It was never a novel, novella, or short story. It was a screenplay. Which leads me to believe Stephen King knew this crazy idea would play a lot better as cinematic silliness for popcorn audiences, and it most certainly does. I can't imagine something like Sleepwalkers existing as a literary work. With all its gags, outlandishness, motifs, and effects-driven set pieces, Sleepwalkers lives very much in a movie world, and it'd be hard to fathom the tongue-in-cheek approach to this narrative translating on the page as well as it does on the screen. The story, of course, is about young Charles, played by Return to the Blue Lagoon's Brian Krause, and his mother Mary, played by Alice Krige of Ghost Story fame, who flee from Bodega Bay and relocate to a small town in Indiana after they drain the life force out of a young girl and leave her for dead. As the story unfolds, we discover that Charles and Mary are an endangered species of shape-shifting, vampiric, werecat creatures who feed off the life force of young virgins in order to survive. When Charles sets his sights on young Tanya, played by the lovely Machen Amick, he must move fast to feed his mother, dodge the local authorities, and defend himself against the encroaching army of domestic cats, who just happen to be natural enemies of Sleepwalkers. If this movie sounds like a bit of a fucking mess, that's because it is. It has some extremely campy moments, you have cheesy one-liners, and then there's a corny kill scene involving an ear of corn, pun most definitely intended.
No vegetables, no dessert.
The first time I rented this movie as a youngster and popped it in my VCR, I actually hit the eject button as soon as I witnessed the laughable transformation scene on the highway, which tends to be the first thing people mention when discussing this film.
What the fuck?
All that being said, I have to admit I adore the hell out of Sleepwalkers. I can't help but love the presence of Hellboy himself Ron Perlman as the police captain, Glenn Shaddix from Beetlejuice as the creepy teacher, and of course Ferris Bueller's parents, Cindy Pickett and Lyman Ward as Tanya's parents. Years later, I revisited Sleepwalkers as a teenager, and I was able to see the film in a different light and understand more or less what Stephen King and Mick Garris were going for. This material was never intended to be taken seriously, and as a kid I couldn't quite grasp the notion of tone, which is why I turned it off on my initial viewing.
This sucks.
Yeah, it really sucks.
To me, at the age of 10, comedy was comedy and horror was horror. And any attempt at humor, whether it was misguided or intentional, had a tendency to go over my head or cause a serious case of tonal whiplash. To be honest, I didn't learn to fully appreciate or understand the over-the-top antics in Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 until I started smoking weed at an older age.
Hey, lick my plate, you dog dick!
I didn't connect with the absolute silliness and stupidity of Silent Night, Deadly Night Part 2, but thankfully now I do. Hell, I used to hate the scene in The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 where the goddamn dog has a flashback, but now I believe it is one of the best things about that film. And the best thing about Sleepwalkers, in my opinion, is the fact that it undoubtedly knows what kind of movie it's supposed to be. There's no doubt in my mind that Stephen King knew what he was doing when he insisted that Mick Garris helm the picture instead of Columbia Pictures' initial choice, Rupert Wainwright. Besides directing music videos for NWA and MC Hammer, Wainwright had virtually no experience at the time in the feature world, especially as a director of horror features. And although he went on to direct the enjoyable biblical horror film Stigmata, Wainwright also went on to direct the abysmal, overly stylized remake of John Carpenter's The Fog. I believe Stephen King knew, as most horror fans know, that Mick Garris, while perhaps not the genre's finest visual stylist, is first and foremost a dedicated fan and lover of all things horror, and it's clearly evident in the execution of his vision. In Sleepwalkers, and in every picture Garris directs for that matter, there's a distinctive sense of childlike wonderment and enthusiasm he brings to all his projects, which can't be negated. Without Mick Garris, we wouldn't have countless archives of horror interviews and retrospectives, nor would we have had legendary horror reunions such as the legendary Showtime series Masters of Horror, and of course the in-depth TV series and podcast Post Mortem.
I'm Mick Garris and this is Post Mortem.
I say all this in defense of Garris because I myself have been critical of his work in the past, mostly questioning his sensibilities as a horror filmmaker and unfairly comparing him to a lot of his contemporaries. And while I maintain my stance on his horror stories being a little too tame and restrained for my taste, I can't deny that there's an inherent spirit in Mick Garris's work that is palpable and enticing, even in serviceable guilty pleasures like Quicksilver Highway and Riding the Bullet. I think what makes Sleepwalkers such a standout seminal film for me, though, is the fact that it reminds me of a period in the 90s when horror felt like a community on the mainstream circuit. And this isn't to say that horror hasn't been communal over the years. In fact, with lots of horror films continuing to pop up on the indie and underground level, there's definitely still a strong sense of community and passion, especially within film festivals and conventions. But in the 80s and 90s, there was a burgeoning group of writers and directors who were all paving the path for the future of horror, defining the genre, transcending it in some cases, and celebrating it for its diversity of ideas. Hollywood took notice of this in those days, and so did Mick Garris. This momentous chapter in horror history felt fortuitous, like a happy accident, almost like it wasn't supposed to happen. Nevertheless, a lot of wildly entertaining films were churned out as a result of this creative cohesion. Let's be honest, a movie like Sleepwalkers would not be greenlit in this day and age, at least not on the mainstream level with a $15 million budget to back it. But you have to remember, at the time, Stephen King was such a hot commodity, he could have written a screenplay about a monstrous turd in a haunted toilet bowl, and the executives would have pulled the trigger as quickly as the cocaine flowed through their nostrils. It's a shame we'll likely never see a sequel to Sleepwalkers either, even though it made its money back and garnered a cult following. According to Mick Garris, Stephen King's wife, Tabitha, actually wrote a treatment for a sequel involving a women's basketball team, which would have been pretty interesting to see. And considering the cult status and popularity of Teen Wolf, I find it hard to believe the studios wouldn't want to make this happen. But this brings me back to my point about the state of the genre today. I don't think the horror genre is dead or in shambles by any means. Regardless of what people might think, there's no denying companies like Shudder, SpectreVision, A24, and Blumhouse are doing what they can to keep horror alive and thriving. But due to certain risk-averse attitudes pervading the majority of studios and production companies, even on the independent level, the results can sometimes feel generic and predictable thanks to the algorithm and the social currency that unfortunately dictates most creative decisions nowadays. Now, it's not my intention to make these fiddly talking points to draw comparisons to Sleepwalkers, as if it's some staple of the horror genre to be held in high esteem. What inspired this essay and a lot of these free-floating thoughts about Sleepwalkers was the ineffable feeling I got upon rewatching the film recently. It was nothing I wanted to go on about that was scene-specific necessarily, and I didn't want to pontificate on the film's importance in the horror genre, although it may certainly seem like I am. But I didn't feel compelled to talk about the movie as much as I felt compelled to talk about the feeling the movie gave me and the jovial mood it put me in. I may be a bit biased because I experienced schlocky films like this all through my childhood, but Sleepwalkers took me back to a time when the execution of the concept seemed to take precedence over the commercialization of the concept. Sleepwalkers was also a reminder that horror doesn't always have to be relentlessly dark, depressing, drab, or overly dramatic. Horror can be campy. It can be fun, silly, and still deliver the thrills. It can be an exhilarating landscape filled with a vast range of emotions and surprises the further you venture into it. This is something I always try to remind myself of when I feel I'm being a little too critical or cynical, which is far too often these days, to be honest. So at the risk of sounding redundant, I don't want to harp on how contemporary horror takes itself too seriously. The statement itself is just too much of a generalization that has more to do with my own sentiments than it does with storytelling in the modern zeitgeist. I would just like to reiterate, though, that there is a noticeable absence of amusement in certain films nowadays that reeks of highbrow pretentiousness. Almost as if the directors have this insatiable desire for critical acclaim or auteur art house status that supersedes the need to entertain and develop camaraderie within the genre.
I think it's really interesting, this tension between iconography that is at once very seductive from an era that is itself very problematic. So the tension between something that you know is flawed, but you're still very drawn to, I think that's something we encounter often as human beings. And it's how we decide to sort of contend with that tension that forms how we move through the world.
The movie in itself, you know, is in the soul of the film. I feel like by existing, the film has we have some obligation to acknowledge what hasn't, you know, all the people who haven't been allowed to take a bow.
But I like films that you have to lean into, and as a viewer, you have to kind of participate in them. It's not all provided for you. You have to imaginatively participate in the film and for it to work. And that means not answering all questions in some respects.
There's definitely consistency in the horror genre in terms of thematic, stylistic, and narrative choices. And while horror has always been a lucrative genre, it's only really been lauded by mainstream critics for its singular artistry in the past decade or so, which I feel has encouraged studios and producers to emphasize creative branding over creative bonding. Sadly, it almost seems like a bifurcation between the enjoyment of the genre and the craftsmanship within the genre. But as John Carpenter once stated in an interview, every generation reinvents horror. They reinvent it in their own time and from their own point of view. The things that are floating in the culture that scare us, those are always changing. The basic fears stay the same. And look, I don't wish for more modern horror films to be like Sleepwalkers. I just wish they were imbued with the same spirit. The same sort of fervent spirit that drove the previous generation of horror masters to celebrate themselves as much as they celebrated the horror landscape. Just seeing the plethora of cameos in Sleepwalkers made me lament the heyday of horror, but it also put a smile on my face and brought me out of a funk. It was a joy to see genre stalwarts like Stephen King, Tobe Hooper, Clive Barker, John Landis, Joe Dante, and Mark Hamill all joining in on the fun as a favor to Mick Garris. Could you even imagine mainstream directors like Robert Eggers, James Wan, Ari Aster, Mike Flanagan, Jordan Peele, or Ty West teaming up like this today? Perhaps the hive minds of horror back in the 80s and 90s were part of this collective consciousness that has since dissipated. Maybe the magic was just a transitory part of a precious bygone era that can't ever be recaptured. But as I close, I just want to say this. Revisiting Sleepwalkers was a treat, to say the least. As hokey as the movie may seem to some, I don't give a cat's ass. It was therapy to me. It was much needed relief from a brief bout of depression that was all over my ass like Clovis on Charles. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed some of these random thoughts on Sleepwalkers and the horror landscape in general. If you decide to revisit Sleepwalkers, just remember, don't take this farcical movie too seriously. Find the fun, let loose, and embrace the absurdity and theatricality of the experience. Sleepwalkers to me is the kind of horror movie for folks who aren't afraid to enjoy themselves. Keep in mind, horror is a broad creative canvas replete with a multitude of moods, styles, techniques, and expressions. Unlike comedy or action, horror is the one genre that's always been hard to pin down due to its multifaceted, malleable nature. It's the only true adaptable genre that possesses the ability to make you jump, gasp, gag, and laugh, possibly all at the same time. Also, a little humor and hokiness every now and then has always played a huge part in the horror genre's success. So next time you pop in a movie like Sleepwalkers, remember what George Romero used to always say with a smile. Stay scared. And remember, Stephen King once wrote, "You can't deny laughter. When it comes, it plops down in your favorite chair and stays as long as it wants." That is it for now, guys. You've been listening to Rich with Red Phone Video. I appreciate you tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next one.